Welcome back to Absolute Units, the official podcast of the Museum of English Rural Life.
Yeah, we keep forgetting to mention that we're an actual museum, don't we, Joe?
We will get there eventually. I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media manager.
And I'm Ollie Douglas, the museum's curator of collections.
Last time we spoke with artist Scott, who goes by Man in the Woods online, about his Friday walks, a series of weekly walks spanning the last 7 years, where each walk he begins where the previous week ended.
So we also chatted about the art that he makes in response to his finds, the stories of different places, and the significance of building new connections to land and landscapes.
This time, we're focusing much more on Man in the Woods artworks, from making 21st century livestock portraits to painstakingly reproducing angry sides about dog poo.
We love those. We explore the significance of art, folk art, and we also do a deep dive into the meaning of mump. Enjoy.
Would you say enjoy one more time?
Enjoy.
Nice. I think that's pretty good.
That was good.
Welcome back, Scott. It's great to have you back on the podcast.
It's great to be back.
So to kick things off, could you tell us a bit about your background? Where did you train and how did you get into making art?
So I actually studied illustration. So there's a kind of immediately an accessible commercial or visual communication angle there rather than necessarily a gallery-based fine art starting point. Although I think a lot of my work is very much kind of like thought and process based, which perhaps is a bit more kind of fine art. I think visually it looks like what it is. I mean, I like art that is not necessarily literal, but I personally like making things that are reasonably straightforward and perhaps quite graphic or illustrative.
I wonder if you could give us a sense of the breadth of media that you work in.
I make a range of things, and I like to think of the things that I'm making as something a bit like artifacts, so kind of objects that help tell a little bit of the story of the landscape that I'm getting to know. I recently finished a cow drawing, which is, I suppose, a reference to the livestock portraiture of the late 18th and early 19th century that was very popular in the rural pubs that I'd stop at with my mum when I was little. I suppose when I'm making an image like that, I'm not just thinking of it as an image, I'm thinking of it as an object that could be in a pub. I also make some posters that are largely inspired by village notice boards. And again, I'm thinking of them as an object that could be on a village notice board rather than just a flat image in an art gallery. I do some three-dimensional work as well, so lots of stitching, some cross-stitch samplers, and I've been making miniature church kneelers or hassocks. Something about making things in miniature is quite exciting to me as well. It feels like you can kind of really get to grips with the world if you can shrink it down.
That's often something that people do with the countryside. So we've got a whole gallery in the museum dedicated to farm toys and sort of model farming. And it's all about trying to encapsulate a world that's actually getting bigger and more mechanized in the mid-20th century. You know, bigger tractors, bigger machinery, bigger pieces of the landscape used for particular kinds of farming. And then trying to miniaturize that and make it something that you can manage and package and communicate to children and to adults about. So making the world smaller and easily communicated.
And that's true in video games as well. One of the most popular video games of the last few years is Stardew Valley, a farming game. And I suppose in the same way farm toys will put a tractor in your hand, these farming games put entire farming communities in a Nintendo Switch screen, for example.
And Scott's taking the countryside and putting it on Instagram and making it carryable around in my pocket on my phone.
And I suppose a museum does the same sort of thing. You're grabbing a cross-section of artifacts that represent the world that you're trying to tell the story of. So you're shrinking down the countryside into one building and telling the story through a few different objects. And I think that, to me, is quite an important part of the way I work, trying to sort of whittle down the kind of essence of the world that I'm kind of slowly exploring so I can kind of get my head around it. And I find that easier with a few different objects rather than trying to completely understand everything, which is obviously impossible.
I think you would love Pendon Model Railway Museum. Have you ever been to Pendon Model Railway Museum?
I haven't, but I think I would like it as well.
It sort of emerged as a project to try and capture bits of the sort of Vale of the White Horse, actually, I think. And they created sort of a diorama, sort of miniature scale diorama of the countryside. They went out and they measured buildings and cottages, and they replicated them at scale. And then they ran a railway, sort of model railway through it. It's now become increasingly about railway modelling. So the interest is in the sort of gauge of the railways and the particular kind of accuracy of those models. But they still maintain this sort of practice of model making. And it's well worth visiting. It's a sort of extraordinary world in miniature behind glass cases that you can sort of peer into. And it picks up the magic of the miniature, I think. I first came to, I think, museums in childhood and in school visits. I can remember a visit to the National Museums of Scotland, and I can still remember the scale models of ancient Egyptian tombs, and it was that sort of Egyptology miniaturization that got me interested in archaeology and anthropology in the first place, which has led me to where I am now. So kind of the miniature is a hook, I think.
I think it's I suppose it's one approach to kind of distilling things into something that's a bit easier to understand and get your head around.
So you talked a little bit about cross-stitch. I think you're creating a cross-stitch map of your walks. How is that going? Is it complex? Because you said they're a little bit like the wires and cables on the table in front of us, which look like they would be complicated to cross-stitch from where I'm sitting.
It's like a pit of snakes, actually.
Yes, and the process of trying to work it out is also a bit like managing a pit of snakes. I think it's quite a silly project, very much a labour of love. I'm probably on my maybe fifth or sixth attempt to try and stitch a map of my walk. There's a very long process that goes into it. So I always plan my actual walk each week using the Ordnance Survey map, and then I inevitably deviate. And then afterwards, I've got a Google Maps file where I then manually plot the actual walk after I've done it, which is quite nice, retracing my steps click by click. And then now that I've come to stitching it, I'm then looking at a satellite view of my Google Maps file and trying to map that back onto the Ordnance Survey map so I can see the walk on a grid, on the kilometre grid that's on the Ordnance Survey map.
Wow.
And then I'm using each thread of the fabric as a kilometre square and then plotting which kilometre squares I've walked through.
You'll have to keep us posted on this. Like, it's the kind of thing we'd love to display on our social media. Or
Yes, I will. It's gonna be a very slow project, and I'm kind of constantly rejigging it, unstitching it, and thinking, actually, do I want to do it like that? Thinking, what things do I want to represent on it? I've had versions where I tried to represent different heights of the land in different colours, or all sorts of different things that ultimately I've done away with.
I love the sort of comparison between the seriousness of this thought about how you're representing height through different colours versus your description of it as a silly project, because I think there's something really significant in being very serious and meticulous about things that are silly and playful. And I think it strikes me that's in a lot of your work, a lot of the ways in which you use the word distilling. You're taking these rural places and spaces and scenes, and you're distilling it down, but in a way that has this kind of joyful spirit to it.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I do is sort of a bit of a waste of time, or a bit silly, and I really like that. I think having a very serious approach to the mundane or the silly or the slightly ridiculous is, I don't know, there's something quite nice about that kind of devotional nature to, say, stitching a cow or making a poster about picking up your dog's poo. I drew a poster, an angry dog poo poster, inspired by a real one I'd seen, which for some reason I decided to draw it using a dip pen and ink, and it took me a few weeks to draw this angry dog poo poster. And I don't know, there's something about that that's quite funny to me, and maybe reflects the funny nature of seeing these angry dog poo posters, which I'm a little bit obsessed with. And I think in that kind of noticing the ridiculous and the mundane and the boring out there in the countryside and kind of making things in reaction to it, I think you also kind of find the specialness of it all and how it kind of weaves through human culture and human experience.
I think there's something really interesting in this, and we can circle back to signage in a minute, I think. But when you're working as a curator and you've sort of got this gatekeepery role where you're trying to sort of govern what can come into the collection and form part of the record to tell the story for the future and future generations, we often ignore the irreverent and the silly and the strange. That's what's so wonderful about working with Joe, I think, is that Joe took the release of Animal Crossings on Nintendo and encouraged people to create smocks for their characters inspired by the collections. So this sort of link of the real lived experience of working class people, the kind of clothes they wore, suddenly on digital characters in a Nintendo game.
So this was actually, it was the third day of the COVID-19 lockdown. My housemate at the time, shout out to Ted, who also formerly worked at the museum. We were just at home and he said to me, it was about 9:05 in the morning, and he said, "Did you know you could make clothes on Animal Crossing?" Which had just came out. And within about 2 hours, we'd put up on social media a call out for people to design heritage smocks on Animal Crossing using our collections as a reference point. And we just had hundreds of smocks sent in from around the world. And I think it was, again, that comparison of something that is a very silly and quite funny and playful thing that people were putting so much love and heart into. We made an online exhibition of them as well, which I'll put a link to in the show notes.
We embrace the silly, in other words. I wanted to come to something else, actually. I'm really interested in what you were saying about the struggle to make these maps of your walks. You're grappling with different technologies to do it. Obviously, in the collections here, we've got technologies to do with the historical mapping and measuring of land, measuring chains, theodolites, waywisers, things like that are about almost the literal physical kind of experience of trying to get your head around the land. And often those are technologies about control. You know, you mentioned the reference point is the Ordnance Survey. The Ordnance Survey obviously has this rootedness in military history. And actually some of the earliest forms of those maps were about Ireland and about control of populations in Ireland and about where the ordnance was. And I wonder whether you're pushing back against that, whether you're doing it consciously or unconsciously. You're using cross-stitch, which doesn't feel like a very military technology. You're using, I guess, open source or sort of freely available tools on the internet to make sense of these experiences. Is that purposeful? Are you trying to do that in an irreverent and a sort of different alternative way?
That's a very interesting question. I like using imperfect processes, but taking them slightly too seriously in a way that you kind of can't really quite justify, because the result will never be perfect and in fact will be full of holes and gaps and inaccuracies.
I think you've just described our podcast project, actually.
So there's something enjoyable to me about the rigmarole of trying to translate a map from the Ordnance Survey map to real life, onto Google Maps, back onto the Ordnance Survey map. Oh, and there's another step in between that where I've got a bit of graph paper for each 100 square kilometre section of the Ordnance Survey map, where I then plot with a pencil each square kilometre that I've walked through. And that again is imperfect because I keep making mistakes, then having to get a red pen and sort of circle the ones that I don't want. And then if I do then walk through that later, what am I going to do then? I don't know. I have to think of another way of showing that I'm reinstating that cross on the grid. But also, even these bits of paper, I've accidentally cut two of them to 1 square too short. So I don't know what I'm going to do when I do walk into that section. And then translating that into cross-stitch, I don't know. I'm not trying to be ridiculous, but I am, I suppose, enjoying the. I suppose there's a natural whimsy that comes out, and I don't know. I suppose I'm kind of almost creating these processes out of necessity, and I don't really particularly want there to be a digital outcome to it, but I'm using this sort of digital process as like a middle ground between the real life walk and then the real physical map at the end. And yeah, I suppose it is quite a strange thing using something that could be used with real precision, like Google Maps, where you can measure something extremely precisely. But the map that I've drawn by just clicking the mouse around rather than measuring my walk and trying to remember which side of the footpath I deviated from when I had to go around that cow or whatever.
In the previous episode, you talked about the difficulty of the route you're going on, or maybe it was our previous conversation before we started recording about the awkwardness of these routes and the fact that awkwardness kind of defines the whole process. It's really striking to me that that is being replicated in how you're choosing to reflect those walks too. So yeah, that sense of struggle is the wrong word, but like the difficulty and effort of it is reflected in the really playful work you're producing, which is interesting.
I think I often think I would suit the life of a kind of medieval hermit monk or something, just dedicating myself to slowly writing the Bible out by hand or tending my vegetables or something, just really repetitive and slightly boring, but maybe at the end you think, that was sort of worth it.
That's how I feel playing management computer games.
Yeah, boring, but with a rhythm to it, a kind of, a repetitive rhythm and purposefulness to it.
Yeah, and I think a real embracing of imperfection, and actually something that I suppose I am really aware of in what I do is that kind of embracing of imperfection as a real reflection of humanity, because it's very easy for anybody to make a perfect image. There's endless software and algorithms that you can use, or you could just dedicate your time to getting very good at drawing something very accurately by hand.
Especially with the rise of AI, it feels to me more than ever that actually the significance of a lot of work is the human work that went into doing it. It is the making of these things that is as interesting now. And
yeah, and I think that's what's really nice about almost collecting artifacts from a country walk. You see signposts that have been designed with sort of strange little bits of clip art, probably about 30 years ago, by somebody working at the council, that have then been reused and scanned and printed and so pixelated that you can't even see what the original image was. Or somebody's, back to angry dog poo posters, just there's so much variation and like a real lack of perfection, just a kind of means to an end that I think makes them like really pure folk art.
I think that's a really interesting point of connection with collections. There are significant collections, both in the UK and elsewhere, that sort of characterise themselves as folk art. I think a lot of things in the Museum of English Rural Life, many people would come to this and think that there are folk art collections here. It's a kind of quite a contested term and an idea that's been defined in various different ways over the years. Often we think of it as things that are about those sort of everyday, mundane, kind of, vernacular art forms that play a part in navigating the world. So pub signs and sort of shop signs and angry dog poo posters. I think there's a sort of amazing diversity and potential in folk art because it can just encompass pretty much everything. I have in front of me a copy of a catalogue from an exhibition called English Popular Art that ran at the Museum of English Rural Life from the 13th of August to the 31st of December 1958. So don't come rushing to come and look at it because it's not here anymore. And it was a loan exhibition lent by a couple of artists and designers called Enid Marks and Margaret Lambert. Now, the Marks Lambert collection is one of the most significant folk art collections in the UK. It's at Compton Verney, so it's well worth going to have a look at some of that material. And there's other folk art material alongside it. But I just thought I would read the very first description that they gave to popular art in rural life just at the start of this catalogue. And maybe get you to respond to that with your sense of what your work is and how it fits into the sort of great pantheon of folk art, if there is such a thing. They described as the term popular art, though we may none of us find it entirely satisfactory, has now come to be so generally accepted that it requires no special definition. That's a get-out clause at the start of a catalogue right there. It has the merit of being sufficiently elastic to include not only handicrafts and things made either by professionals or amateurs in the countryside itself, but also things made to country needs and tastes in towns and by machinery, or even imported from abroad, like American clocks. How do you feel about your work? Is it folk art? Do you feel that folk art is a useful term? You're a trained artist. I mean, you're trained as an illustrator. You've got that kind of professional practice underpinning what you do. Is that pushing back against the idea of folk art?
I don't think I make folk art. I mean, I'm happy for anybody to describe my work however they want, but I think I make art about folk, sometimes about folk art. Sometimes, like, the Angry Dog Poo poster, for example, is like, for me, I think the word art is maybe a subjective thing. I suppose if I'm enjoying the kind of visual or sort of spiritual quality of an object, then to me it's art. But yeah, I think I'm making art about folk practice, folk custom, folk motifs, as in, things just of ordinary, everyday working class life, rather than making folk art itself, because I think I'm too conscious and aware of what I'm doing. So I don't think I would describe it as folk art.
Circling back to what we were talking about earlier about the effort that you put into your work, a lot of what you're making art about are signs that really may not have been made with much effort. So if someone's doing putting up an Angry Dog Poo poster, these things often strike you as being very impulsive. It's someone who's just opened Word or Microsoft Publisher and just put in all caps, clean up your dog poo with 15 exclamation marks. Maybe not always, but in often case, it's something that is designed with utility solely in mind. It's not an aesthetic object. I think your art is taking these things that were built in a very fast way, but it's doing so in a very careful and slow and methodical way, reproducing those things in a different context.
Yeah, I struggle to justify what I'm doing. And I pretty much always think the original artifact that I've seen out there is better than what I've made in response to it, for exactly that reason, the kind of immediacy and the kind of pragmatism and the impulse of it. And it being a real artifact of its time, being constrained by, like you said, Microsoft Publisher or whatever it is. But I suppose the kind of devotional and slow and ridiculous process that I'm applying to making something in response to it is perhaps more of a sign of my kind of fascination and almost desire to kind of communicate what I see is beautiful in the original object, which I think maybe is slightly easier for people to get if you say, oh, I actually describe myself as an artist and I have drawn this, whereas they might go, oh, that's funny, whereas they might pass the 3 or 4 different posters or things on a village notice board that inspired that thing that I've made and not really think anything of it because they do see the utilitarianness of it. So I think perhaps there is something owed to that kind of process of slowly making an image in a kind of artistic tradition that helps communicate that.
Perhaps
I hope.
For sure. And what your art does is it makes you reflect on the artistry of these original documents. Something can be made very fast, and of course, possibly not made as an aesthetic object. It is still an aesthetic object because it's a creation that exists in the world. And your art draws focus back to that after you see it. The responses you have make you rethink the original artifacts.
Yeah, completely. And I get people send me pictures of signs saying this looks like something that you could have made. But I mean, the original will literally just be something printed out from Microsoft Word, which is funny because none of my work is printed out from Microsoft Word. But I quite like that people see that.
I think there's something quite interesting in the fact that you use visual work in collaboration with typeface. So type and or text plays a significant role in some of the pieces of work you create, particularly the posters, but even in the cow image, there's a text in there underneath. It's quite a particular text. Joe pointed out to me that actually the creator of Comic Sans, that iconic, slightly playful and irreverent font that many of us love to hate, actually trained in Reading. So, here in Reading, we have a very significant, globally significant department of typography. They actually have collections. They have a collection known as the Letterpress and Graphic Design Collection. This is the colloquially referred to as the typography collection. And we have connections with them in terms of sort of managing and looking after large bodies of material. In amongst that, there's a whole lot of printing material and ephemera, sort of rural printing material, early printing material, bill posters and chapbooks and things that I think have a kind of visual correspondence with some of what you're doing, which is about kind of capturing everyday communication, doing it in a really visual, punchy way, but doing it with a sort of slight playfulness as well.
You're removing that utility, but in a way drawing more focus and attention back to the actual aesthetic and design choices people are making, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we're trying to do in museum gallery design as well. We're trying to use punchy visual and textual ways of sort of communicating to make sense of worlds that seem a little bit unfamiliar to our audiences. So you're kind of like you're a museum curator, a wandering, rural, creative museum curator with far more creative and artistic talent.
I'm sure there's plenty of talent at the Museum of English Rural Life.
Not when it comes to artwork and typeface.
Or cable management.
Yeah, no, definitely not cable management.
It is interesting. When I look through your work, the typography and the decisions you're making was really prominent. I mean, do you have specific fonts and typefaces that you prefer?
I've always liked typography generally. I'm not an expert at all. I quite like that period where people start using some really kind of like geometric sans serif fonts like Futura, Gill Sans Johnston on the London Underground. And there's something quite culture specific about, or maybe geography specific about some of them as well. Like, I mean, Gill Sans and Johnston, I mean, they're kind of instantly recognisable as very English, I think. And then more recently, I grew up in an era where all of my school homework was typed in either Arial, Times New Roman, Comic Sans, or brush script. And I think in that way, typefaces can be cultural artifacts, and it kind of affects almost how you hear or how you interpret the words that are written in it. If you see some old English black letter on the outside of a pub, you're going to know it's a certain kind of pub. And I quite like that. I think a lot about these things, even though I don't necessarily imitate or use the same kind of lettering on the things I'm making in response to the things I see outside. It's definitely something I'm drawn to and think a lot about.
So in a previous job, I worked at the Pitt Rivers Museum at the University of Oxford. This is going back about, almost 20 plus years now. And one of the roles I had, I mean, it's a kind of museum that many people will have visited and know well, but it's a sort of complicated archaeological and anthropological collection, really densely packed displays that echo a kind of Victorian aesthetic. And over the years, it's become known for these small handwritten labels. Not much focus on the text in terms of museum display and interpretation. Historically, it had case headers that described what were in the cases, but over the years, many of these had fallen off. So the job that I had was, as an interpretation officer, was to try and find a way to reinstate case headers that were period appropriate or fitted with the visual aesthetic of the galleries, but described sufficiently what was in these cases so that people, when they encountered them, didn't just have to try and look at small handwritten texts on tiny little labels that they probably couldn't read anyway. And actually what we discovered, you mentioned Gill Sans, what we discovered was that the few surviving case headers were in a typeface that was almost equivalent to Gill Sans. It was probably based on Gill Sans, so that was the reference point, which kind of situated it very strongly in this kind of this aesthetic that's about mapping and making sense of the world. You know, the London Underground, a kind of classic way of taking a very complicated, messy cable-like system, like the cables on the table in front of us, and turning that into something simple, communicable, and easily understood. I think there's something interesting in the fact that you trained as an illustrator, and illustration is about that relationship often with text. And so many people, particularly in mid-20th century connections to the countryside and art, so many of them are either trained as illustrators or as designers. And I'm thinking of Edward Bawden is a classic example. Enid Marks and Margaret Lambert being other examples of people who played part in this sort of creation of an aesthetic that's often referred to now as mid-century modern. I think sometimes it plays a part in what I think I've heard Joe refer to as cottagecore in the past. There's a sort of popularity about that rustic mid-century idea. And I think some of your work is echoing actually quite a long tradition of people playing around with this relationship with the vernacular and the designed order. Is there a sort of rootedness and a deliberacy in terms of any of your reference points artistically or creatively, or are you carving your own path like you are when you're out there picking a sort of new direction to turn on a Friday?
I very rarely intentionally look at other artists' work in that kind of way. But having said that, I'm quite a big fan of Edward Borden and Eric Ravilius and Paul Nash. So I deliberately don't look at their work because I don't want my work to become theirs. And I think it could very easily, because of how much I like the kind of sense of place you get from what they're doing. But I think what you said about that mix of vernacular and designed, I think is really interesting. And that kind of tension or coming together is something I find fascinating in the countryside. I mean, you see a lot of things which are clearly very designed and are kind of plonked and imposed in the place, next to stuff that has just been done that way forever because it's been done that way. And that's why I like a poster that's been made on Microsoft Word, because could you almost describe that as vernacular? I mean, not in that it's grown out of a particular place, but it has grown out of a set of constraints in a particular digital place. So yeah, I don't know. I'm very interested in all of this. I don't have a particularly concrete answer, but yes, I'm interested in those things, and I suspect that I'm probably more influenced than I am aware of by that kind of tradition of essentially male artists concerned with the countryside in England.
I also want to quickly turn to the fact that some of your work is characterised as the Museum of Mump. Can you tell us a bit more about Museum of Mump? What is that? Where did that come from? Does that connect to any of these sort of artistic traditions that you're talking about? Is that entirely your own thing? Is it rooted in any way in actual museums? Where are the points of inspiration there?
Okay, well, I don't really use that name anywhere other than in my email address at the moment. But for a while, it was like a useful container.
Museums do that. There are useful containers.
I mean, really, very literally, I found it easier to... we spoke last time about the kind of wanting to both make something new myself and also communicate the magic of what I'm seeing out there, and that kind of tension between wanting to document literally and wanting to make something that's my own. And I suppose that's where I arrived at this idea of making things which I can think of as perhaps artifacts that maybe live in the real world, or perhaps in a kind of, a secondary world, a version of the world. And just as a kind of almost thought exercise, I thought it would be easier to make things for an imagined museum than for no purpose at all. So for a little while, I was referring to my body of work as the Museum of Mump. And Mump because I'm fascinated with words and place names and sort of etymology, but also just feeling things out. And you often get similarly shaped words which have very similarly shaped meanings, like mumps and bump and tump and lump. They're all quite similar concepts with ever so slightly different words. And I think there's perhaps this is a bit of a hobby horse, but in Britain's prehistoric past, there's been a real kind of obsession with lumps on the landscape. And you especially see it if you go to flatlands like the Somerset Levels, where every little kind of island out of the levels feels really prominent. And you get places like Glastonbury Tor, which have a very long history of kind of ritual or religious behaviour around them. And there is a place called Borough Mump down in Somerset as well. And then you get man-made lumps like Silbury Hill near Avebury, near the stone circle of Avebury. And I'm sort of fascinated by those as ritual focuses in the landscape, and almost a little version perhaps of Britain as an island surrounded by the sea. So yes, so for I suppose naming this kind of imagined museum, the Museum of Mump, was almost like a way of creating a kind of an imagined version of Britain focused around this ritual landscape, where I could put these artifacts and kind of give it a bit of direction. As I've got more into the flow of what I'm making, I don't really tend to use that name anymore, but I do sort of think about my work in very much that context.
I'd never thought before about lump and bump as having similar kind of roots, and I can see in a way that the British Islands are a lump out of the sea.
I think dump is another good one.
Dump,
When you
yeah.
dump something, you end up with a lump of it.
So is the Museum of English Rural Life like a mump then? We're a mump, a
Mump
dump,
or core.
a dump. We're more of a dump than a mump, I think. People giving us
Or a
stuff.
dump of lumps, mumps,
Yeah.
bumps. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. I think in that idea is this sort of sense that somehow you're creating a kind of corpus, a body of material, a collection. You've mentioned sort of there's a degree of archiving to the process of making the maps, the objects that you create. Some of them are things that are designed to be out there in the world having a life, tote bags and badges and T-shirts and those kind of objects, all of which, interestingly, you could take on a walk. That struck me as well. The things that you create, often they're things that you could be carrying with you on a walk, having just got off a bus somewhere in rural England. Is there a body of material you're pulling together? Is there an archive of your work? Do you have a vision of what's happening to that? Is it something purposeful, or is that sort of inadvertent museum of mump that may not be called the Museum of Mump anymore? Is that just emerging happenstance?
I am constantly trying to work this out. I'm usually making kind of on whim and based on just what I feel particularly like making at the moment. But I'm very regularly trying to work out what structure this fits into and how I curate it. And I have quite a lot of respect for actual museum curators because I find it impossible to get my head around how to curate and sort of collect together and categorize my own work. And it's sort of a bit of an obsession. And I've got far fewer things than the average museum with far fewer options for categories. And I still find it an absolute...
a nightmare.
A nightmare, yes.
Wakes you up in the middle of the night, you know.
Yes, yeah.
I have cold sweats about collections management. You wake up, you know, with a purposeful sense of drawing a cow. Each to our own. What wakes you up, Joe?
Plugging in cables into roadcaster mixers.
Yeah, I think that feels like a really nice place to maybe reflect on your work and its connection directly back to the museum. I'm thinking here about the cows and the connection to livestock portraiture. We have posters in the collection. Often they're posters connected to village fates, things like that, or they're about getting out into the countryside. We have a few examples of railway posters and things like that are about exactly trying to encourage people to do what you're already doing. And we also have signage. I'm interested in the kinds of signage that you're talking about, though, because they're not the kinds of signage that probably we would acquire. We wouldn't acquire the printed off a printer at home Comic Sans complaint about dog poo. I think that's a shame in a way, and I hope that your record of those will be a record of things that might otherwise slip through the net of curatorial practice at my end of things. We're doing the same job and we're doing it from different corners, I think. So you're doing us an amazing service here by picking up on things that might slip through the curatorial gaps.
That's a very kind description. I think what I'm doing is a lot more whim based, but but yes, I do desire to kind of catalogue and document the landscape that I'm getting to know.
Whim based, but in a very serious way, and I think that's wonderful.
Yes, yeah. You have to go full throttle at it.
One final reflection from me is that all of these things that have been created in the past for a very particular purpose, whether they're railway posters or livestock portraiture to sort of celebrate a particular prize animal, or maybe even promote that particular breed or that bloodline, they all come to take new meanings when we put them on display in a museum like this. Have you ever reflected on what might happen to your work? It's obviously out there in the world having a life of its own. How are people reinterpreting it and reimagining it? How might they do that in 50 and 100 years' time?
I kind of wonder if the few bits that survive might just be dug up in a charity shop by somebody who goes, oh, that's nice, 50p, yeah, I love that.
I think you're underselling yourself there. I think your work is going to be far more significant.
We'll check back in 20 years' time. Yeah. So yeah, as we draw this to a close, where can people find more of your work?
So I post a lot on Instagram, just as a very visual platform. I find that's quite a good way of sharing things. I share a weekly video of my Friday walk, and I share a lot of musings and ramblings and pictures of what I make. I do share my videos to TikTok. I don't really put much of what I'm making on there, but I'm going to change that. I am on Blue Sky as well, and I have a mailing list. If you
Is
go
that
to
an emailing list?
an email mailing list. I'd love it to be a physical one. One day maybe.
Bring it
handwritten.
back. Yeah.
And yeah, I've got an online shopping website, which is maninthewoods.co.uk. Sure, if you type Man in the Woods into Instagram, you'll probably find me.
And we'll put links to these in. We'll put links to one of these in the show notes as well.
Scott, that's been absolutely amazing, and I think we've covered a huge range of topics that connect directly back to the kinds of things that we do here in the museum. I'm slightly sad that you walk alone, and that we can't come and join you on one of your walks. But maybe we could take a different kind of walk someday, and hopefully you'll be back to walk around the galleries again.
And it's been very nice going on this walk with you the last 2 hours through all kinds of different topics. So.
Navigating our way through the chaos of Joe's cables on the table.
Yeah.
We should absolutely go for a real life.
That would be really nice.
Walk.
We can plan that.
Yeah. Sounds great.
Well, thanks so much, Scott.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a lovely chance to chat about these things.
Yeah, that's been a real treat for us. So yeah. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Say bye, Ollie.
Bye, Ollie. No, bye.
Do it again one more time.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Absolute Units. Your hosts have been me, Ollie Douglas, and my colleague and producer, Joe Vaughan.
Absolute Units is made possible by the support of Arts Council England and Museums Partnership Reading.
If you're enjoying the pod, please leave us ratings and reviews wherever you're listening, and share the pod on social media.
We'll be back in 2 weeks' time speaking to award-winning photographer Amy Bateman, whose photographs of farming in contemporary Cumbria star in our current exhibition, 40 Farms. See you next time.